"Get up, monsieur! Make the liquors! The customer is here!" Thérèse Wands said, flinging each word at her husband as if it were a small stone. Xavier Wands, her husband, seemed to be thinking thoughts of his own. He continued to sit at the table with the white tablecloth staring at his glass. Thérèse, in only a few moments in her tent, had managed to sweep her abundant brown hair up on her head in an appealing mound. The gown she wore did not quite conceal her plump shoulders. Augustus McCrae, who had not expected to see a woman, much less an attractive woman, for several years, if ever, found that the sight of Thérèse brought an immediate improvement in his mood. She stood in the middle of the barroom floor, hands on her hips, looking at the rangers cheerfully. "See already the customers," she said to Xavier. "Vite, vite, make the liquors." Xavier Wands compressed his lips, and then, as if propelled by a spasm of fury, jumped from his chair and strode over to the tent, beside which a sizable mound of goods was covered by a large wagon sheet. Xavier dove under the sheet like a rat seeking cover. For a moment only his rump was visible, but in the space of a minute he emerged with 2 bottles of whiskey and several glasses. He hurried to the bar, set the bottles and glasses on it, and paused to straighten his cuffs. "Messieurs," he said, bowing slightly, "the pleasures are mine." "If the bar's open, I expect a few of those pleasures might be ours, too," Gus said. P.I. declined the liquor, and Dietz wasn't offered any, but in a few minutes the other rangers, including young Jake Spoon, were all seated around the table where Xavier had sat. At Thérèse's strident urging, Xavier had applied himself again to the mound under the wagon sheet and come out with several chairs. "These glasses are clean," Gus said in astonishment. "You could spend a week in the saloons of Austin and never encounter a clean glass." As soon as each glass was emptied, a process that didn't take long, Xavier appeared with a bottle, poured, and bowed. "Monsieur," he said invariably. Ikey Ripple, who had passed easily and quickly into a state of profound inebriation, found himself a little put off by the bowing. "Why is he bowing to us?" Ikey asked. "To be polite. Why shouldn't he bow?" Augustus asked. "That's right, a bartender ought to bow," Lee Hitch said. Although so far as he could remember, none of the bartenders of his acquaintance had ever bothered to bow to him before. "I say it's a goddamn trick," Ikey declared. "I think he means to get us drunk and steal all our money." "Ikey, if you've got cash money on you, you don't need to wait for a Frenchman to steal it," Gus said. "Loan it to me and I'll invest it for you." "Invest it in whores? That's all you know about, Gus," Ikey said. "Well, that way you wouldn't have to be anxious about it," Gus told him. Thérèse Wands, a smile on her lips, seemed to be studying the rangers closely. P.I. had elected to help Dietz with the horses, but Jake Spoon had boldly taken his place at the table and was drinking whiskey as if he had a right to, a fact that annoyed Gus McCrae a good deal. Even more annoying was the fact that the Frenchwoman was looking at Jake with interest. "Jake, you ought to be helping with the horses," Gus said in an irritable tone. Jake knew well that when Gus was out of temper, it was better to walk small. He saw the Frenchwoman watching him, but didn't connect it with Gus's angry tone. After all, the woman's husband was standing right behind her. Thérèse decided right away that she liked Monsieur McCrae, but she saw nothing wrong with flirting a little with the curly-headed boy. Opportunities to flirt were limited in Lonesome Dove. Opportunities to make money were no less rare, and Thérèse liked money. Captain and Thérèse liked money. Captain King assured her there would soon be a brisk trade in the town. He seemed to think that merchants would rush to Lonesome Dove in order to take advantage of the fine river crossing, but so far very few merchants had appeared, a fact which frustrated Thérèse's commercial instincts severely. Now, at the sight of the tired, dusty, unshaven men, Thérèse began to think in terms of money. She quickly decided that the first task would be to barber them. They could all use shaves, and 2 or 3 of them needed haircuts as well. "Xavier, the woods, monsieur," she said crisply with a glance at her husband. "I want to shave these men and give them their hair-offs." Xavier Wands, severely depressed as he was by the many differences between Texas and France, walked over to a campfire that smoldered in front of the tent. He would have preferred himself to sit at the table all day, enjoying the seemliness of his clean tablecloth, and perhaps drinking just enough liquor to blind himself to the ugliness of the mesquite trees that surrounded the clearing, where, if Captain King was to be believed, a town would one day exist. Therese, of course, had her own ideas. Every day Lonesome Dove presented some new challenge to her energies, and her energies were not small. Every day in this new land Therese arose impatient. Every day Xavier was the man who bore the brunt of her impatience. Yesterday Therese's impatience had overflowed and scared away the carpenters. Today at least there were these men to occupy her, these rangers. If she wanted to barber them, it was fine with him. With his foot he nudged a few more sticks of firewood into the fire before returning to his bar. "Herr-offs, Therese said, coming to the table. "You first, monsieur," she said, tapping Augustus on the shoulder. "All right, I'll volunteer. Do I get a shave, too?" Gus said. Therese didn't answer. She'd already marched off to her tent. When she emerged, carrying a razor strop, and several other tools of the barbering trade, she pulled another chair from under the wagon sheet and insisted that Gus sit on it. The rangers, most of them now drunk, watched with interest as Therese vigorously stropped her razor. "I'm shaggier than Gus. You ought to have barbered me first," Stove Jones complained. "What you complaining about? I'll be lucky to even get a shave," Lee Hitch said, well aware that his bald head offered little incentive to a barber. Jake Spoon gulped down what was left of the whiskey and went off to sit with P.I. and Dietz. It was vexing that Gus McCrae seemed to get the first attentions if a woman was around. Now the woman was wrapping Gus in a sheet and cooing over him as if he were something special. The sight put Jake in such a hot mood that he picked up 3 clods and threw them at the blue sow, who had consumed the bull snake and had flopped down under a small bush to rest. The clods missed, but Xavier Wands noticed and immediately walked over to Jake. "Monsieur," he said sternly, "do not disturb the pig." "That's right, it ain't your pig, don't be chunking it," Gus said from his barber chair. "That pig's the pride of the community. It needs its rest." His pride stung, Jake walked straight past P.I. and on toward the river. He had merely thrown 3 clods at a sow. What right had Gus to speak to him in such a tone? He felt like quitting the Rangers on the spot. He could hammer and saw. Maybe the French couple would hire him to be a carpenter. With Gus gone, the Frenchwoman might even come to like his curly hair, as Madame Skull once had. Perhaps she would take him up and teach him the language. He imagined how chagrined Gus McCrae would be if the next time the Ranger stopped in Lonesome Dove, he and Madame Wands were chattering in French. "Where do you suppose he's going?" P.I. asked when Jake walked past. "Could be going to take a wash," Dietz said. "Now you've run Jake off, picking on him," Lee Hitch remarked. "The pup, he's welcome to drown himself for all I care," Gus said, well aware that he was the envy of the troop by virtue of having been chosen to receive the first haircut. Therese Wands, though flirtatious in her approach to barbering, was all seriousness when she got down to the business itself. She decided to start with a shave and promptly lathered Gus's face liberally with a nice-smelling soap. "Boy, this beats that old lye soap," Gus said, but Therese rapped his head sharply with her knuckles, indicating that the time for talk was over. Therese then shaved him carefully and expertly, not omitting to do some careful work under his nose. Then she wrapped his face in a hot towel and began the haircut, moving his head this way and that, touching him, making him sit up straighter, or insisting that he turn one way or another. With the hot towel steaming on his face and Therese's deft hands working it with scissors and comb, Gus drifted into a kind of half-sleep, in which he allowed himself to imagine that it was Clara doing the barbering. On occasion, dissatisfied with the work of the local barbers, Clara had barbered him, sitting him down on the steps behind the store and scissoring away until she had him looking the way she wanted him to look, a process that took much squinting and inspecting. Therese Wands, more expert than Clara, was also more decisive. When she took the hot towel off his face, she produced some small tweezers and began to yank the hairs out of his nose. Gus had never had his nose hairs interfered with before. He was relaxed, half asleep, and a little drunk. The first extraction took him so completely by surprise that he yelped. His companions had been watching the barbering operation closely, all of them filled with envy. When Therese yanked out the first nose hair, Gus's reaction struck them as the funniest thing they had ever seen. They howled with laughter. Lee Hitch was so amused that a chair could not hold him. He lay on his back on the floor of the saloon, laughing violently. Stove Jones laughed nearly as loud. Far down the street, Jake Spoon heard the laughter and turned, wondering what could be so funny. P.I. and Dietz, who had been trimming a gelding's hoof, had not been paying too much attention to the barbering. When they saw the Frenchwoman pulling hairs out of Gus's nose, they began to laugh too. Augustus McCrae, who had been in a pleasurably relaxed state, found that he had suddenly become an object of wild amusement to the men. Therese, though, brooked no resistance. She finished his nose to her satisfaction and began to yank hairs out of his ears, oblivious to the laughter from the saloon. She proceeded briskly with her tweezers, seizing a hair and extracting it with the same motion. Xavier Wands, standing stiffly behind a bar, thought the men he was serving must be crazy. He had never heard such desperate laughter, and at what? Because his wife was giving their captain the hair-offs? Not knowing quite what to do, he contented himself with folding and refolding his little white towel several times. The hairs out, Therese began to rub Gus with an unguent whose smell she liked. The young monsieur had nice hair. She felt she might enjoy entertaining him in her tent for a bit, if only Xavier could be distracted, which didn't seem likely. Meanwhile, there was business. Once she had combed Gus's hair the way she considered that it ought to be combed, she took the sheet off him and announced that he could stand up. $1, monsieur, she said. Now you look like a fine cavalier. Augustus was somewhat startled by the price. He had not expected to pay more than 50 cents for his barbering in such a place. Many a whore would cost little more than the haircut. But Therese smiled at him and whisked him off with her little brush. He liked her plump shoulders. Why be tight? "A bargain at the price, ma'am," he said, and paid her the $1. When Call came back to Lonesome Dove with the 4 carpenters, he was surprised to find that the whole troop had been barbered and shaved. P.I. was just rising from the chair when he rode up. Only Dietz, watching silently from a seat on a stump, had not been worked on. All the men were preening as if they had just come out of church. Therese Wands, the woman who had clipped the considerable pile of hair that was around the barber chair, was bent over a large washtub wringing out a towel. "Ma'am, you need to strop your razor. Here's one more," Gus said. "I'll take your horse, Woodrow. You've got a treat in store." Madame Wands was evidently a woman of cheerful temperament. She sat Call down and poured out a torrent of French. "Do you know what she's saying?" he asked Augustus. "Just keep still and do your duty, Woodrow," Gus said. Madame Wands made a little bow when she sat Call in the barber's chair. He felt a touch of embarrassment. He had heard of women barbers, but had never been worked on by one before. All of the men were in high good humor. They looked more presentable than they had looked in months. "I expect you better shear me," Call said. "It'll probably be a good spell before I see a barber again." Call had relaxed and slipped into a half-doze by the time Therese Wands got around to the extraction of his nose hairs. He jumped so violently at the first jerk of the tweezers that he turned the barber chair over. All the men who had been watching for just such a reaction exploded with laughter. Augustus laughed so hard he had to hold his side. Even Call had to smile. It must have been funny seeing him tip over a barber's chair. "I wish we had old Buffalo Hump here," he said. "I expect he'd think this was a pretty fancy torture." Therese, undeterred, sat him down again and applied the tweezers until his nose was plucked clean of hairs. Later, when they were all cleaned up enough to look almost as respectable as Xavier Wands's tablecloth, Therese proved that she was as skilled a cook as she was a barber. A sizable flock of half-wild chickens chirped amid the crumbling adobe huts. Therese snatched 4 of them, collected a great number of eggs, and made them all a feast which included potatoes. The men ate so much they could scarcely stumble off the floor of the saloon to be where the feast had been served on a folding table Xavier had produced from under the wagon sheet. "If people knew they could get fed like this, Lonesome Dove would be a town in no time," Gus said. "I wouldn't mind moving here myself. It would save the expense of all that high-priced Austin liquor." "Yes, but what would you do for cash?" Call asked. "It's fine eating, but there'd be no one to pay you a wage." Therese had put 2 candles on the folding table. Other than their flickering light, the only illumination came from the high moon. "Captain King expects there'll be businesses here someday because of the fine river crossing," Gus said. "If there's businesses here, I guess we could have one too." "Speak for yourself," Call said. "I'm a Texas Ranger and I aim to stay one." "Now, that's a damn boresome point of view," Gus said. "Just because we started out being Rangers don't mean we have to stay Rangers all our lives. The Army will whip out the Indians in a few more years and there won't be much to do anyway." "Maybe, but there's plenty to do right now," Call said. "Mr. Xavier, now he's a curious fella," Gus said. "He's been standing behind that bar all day and he's still standing behind it." Call looked. Sure enough, Xavier still held his position behind the long bar, although all the Rangers had either fallen asleep or left the floor of the saloon. "Between the barbering and the liquor, they made a pretty penny on us today," Call said. "I expect they'll soon prosper." The two of them strolled away from the unbuilt saloon and the camp where their comrades slept and meandered toward the river. They heard the water before they saw it, and when they did see it, it was only the flicker of moonlight here and there on the surface. "Lonesome Dove will need a whore or two, otherwise it won't grow," Augustus allowed. "Prosperous businessmen won't long tolerate the absence of whores." "You can't tolerate it, you mean," Call said. "That's one reason you'll never be a prosperous businessman." "Well, I just wasn't meant to work at one trade all my life," Augustus said. "I'm too fond of variety." "If you like variety, I don't see how you can beat rangering," Call said. "A month ago we were freezing on the plains, trying not to get scalped, and now we're off to Mexico, where we'll be hot and probably get shot." "Is the captain sending the cattle?" Gus asked. "If he is, I hope they don't come for a day or two. A little more of that woman's cooking might improve my cowboying." "He's not sending the cattle. No interest," Call said. "No interest?" Gus said, astonished. "No cattle? What are we going to do, Woodrow?" They both stood looking across the river at Mexico, the dark country. "Maybe the captain's already escaped," Gus said. "He's sly, the captain. He could be halfway home by now." "He might be halfway dead, too," Call pointed out. "If we can't raise the cattle, what do we do?" Augustus asked. "Go after him anyway? Or give up again?" "You're a captain, same as I am," Call said. "What do you want to do?" "The two of us might go in alone and sneak him out." "Why, yes, and pigs might cuss," Gus said. "What'll happen is we'll get caught too, and the state of Texas won't bother sending no expedition after us." Still, once he thought about it, something about the adventure of trying to rescue Captain Skull appealed to him, and the thought of a herd of cattle did not. "It's getting to be the fly season, Woodrow," Gus said. Call waited. Augustus didn't elaborate. "What's your point?" Call asked finally. "We can't stop the seasons from turning." "Nope, but we could avoid cattle during the fly season," Gus said. 1,000 cattle would attract at least 1,000,000 flies, which is more flies than I care to swat." "We don't have 'em anyway," Call said. "And if Captain King won't give 'em to us, nobody will." "Anyway, he's right. We could no more drive 1,000 cattle across Mexico than we could 1,000 jackrabbits." "That's right. We ain't vaqueros," Gus said. The two of them fell silent, looking across to Mexico. Though they quarreled frequently, they were often tugged by the same impulses, and so it was at that moment by the slow river. The longer they looked across it, the more strongly they felt the urge to attempt their mission alone, without cattle and without the other men. "We could just do it, Woodrow, the two of us," Augustus said. "We'd have a better chance than if we take the cattle or the troop." Call agreed. "I'm game if you are," he said. "I think it's about time we made something of ourselves anyway." "I'd just like to travel with less company myself," Gus said. "I don't know about making something of ourselves." "Buffalo Hump's held the plains ever since we've been Rangers," Call pointed out. "We've never whipped him. And Ahumato's held the border. We've never whipped him either. We can't protect the plains or the border either. That's poor work in my book." "Woodrow, you're the worst I've ever known for criticizing yourself," Gus said. "We've never rangered with more than 12 men at a time. Nobody could whip Buffalo Hump or Ahumato with 12 men." Call knew that was true, but it didn't change his feeling. The Texas Rangers were supposed to protect settlers on the frontier, but they hadn't. The recent massacres were evidence enough that they weren't succeeding on their job. "You ought to give up and open a store if you feel that low about it," Augustus suggested. "There's a need for a store now that the Forsythes are dead. You can marry Mag while you're at it and be comfortable." "I don't want to run a store or marry either," Call said. "I'd just like to feel that I'm worth the money I'm paid." "No, what you want is to take a big scalp," Gus said. "Buffalo Humps or ahumados, that's what you want. Me, I'd take the scalp too, but I don't figure it would change much." "If you kill the Hefe, it might change something," Call argued. "No, because somebody else just as mean will soon come along," Gus said. "Well, we rarely agree," Call said. "No, but let's go to Mexico anyway," Augustus said. "I'm restless. Let's just saddle up and go tonight. There's a fine moon. Without the boys to slow us down, we could make 40 miles by morning." Call felt tempted. He and Augustus at least knew one another's competencies. They would probably fare better alone. "What's your hurry?" he asked Gus. "Why tonight?" "If I stay around, I expect that Frenchwoman might fall in love with me," Gus said. "Her husband might fight me. It'd be a pity to get blood on that nice tablecloth." "You suppose the boys can find their way back to Austin if we leave?" Call asked. "Ikey Ripple claims to have never been lost," Augustus reminded him. "I expect it's a boast, but I think we should put him to the test. If the other boys don't want to try it with Ikey, they can stay and help build the saloon. The town would grow quicker if they had a saloon that didn't expose you to the weather. If the saloon had a roof and there was a whore or two and a livery stable, Lonesome Dove might be a place somebody might want to live." "The boys will be right surprised when they wake up and find us gone," Call said. "A little startlement would be better than being caught by Ahumado," Gus pointed out. "From what I've heard, he ain't gentle." The white moon soared over Mexico. The longer the two men looked, the stronger beckoning they felt from the unknown land. "If we had cattle, I'd try it the way we were supposed to," Call said. "But the fact is, we don't." When they got back to the saloon, the 2 candles had been blown out and the Wanzas had retired to their tent. "I doubt that tent really belonged to Napoleon," Call said. "He was the emperor. Why would he give it up?" "He might have just liked Therese if he'd met her," Augustus said. "I like her myself, even if she did pull hairs out of my nose." Dietz was the only man awake when the 2 of them were saddling their horses and selecting a few provisions. At first he supposed the 2 captains were just going off on a scout. When Call came over and informed him that they were going to try and rescue Captain Skull themselves, Dietz's eyes grew wide. He knew it was not his place to question the action of his 2 captains, but he could not entirely suppress his apprehension. "We way down here in the brush," he said. It wasn't that Dietz felt exactly lost, it was just that he didn't feel exactly safe. The big Indian with the hump might come, or if not him, someone just as bad. Call felt a little guilty as he gathered up his gear. He was usually the one impatient to leave, but this time it was Augustus who was in a sweat to get started. Call felt he ought to wake up 1 or 2 of the men and let them know what was happening. But Augustus argued against it. "These men have been drinking ever since we got here," he pointed out. "They're drunk and they're asleep. Let's just go. They ain't new calves, they're grown men. I doubt we'll be gone more than a few days. If they don't want to head back to Austin, they can stay here and wait for us." Several loud snores could be heard as they talked. Call felt that they ought to leave instructions, but again Gus protested. "You don't always have to be telling people every single thing to do, Woodrow," he complained. "They need to work up some independence anyway. If we wake them up, they might quarrel and start punching one another." "All right," Call said. It didn't feel quite right, but there was logic in what Gus said. P.I. woke up as the 2 captains talked. He saw them mount and ride out of camp. In a minute or 2 he heard their horses take the river. But it was not an unusual thing. Captain Call particularly often rode off at night to scout a little. P.I. supposed it was no more than that, and went back to sleep.